absent-minded friends. We're back for more absent-minded rambling, because we're very creative with names on this channel. Anyhow, today is Mead Day, and that's a glorious day to drink mead. Mead, simply put, is a fermentation of honey and water. Because honey sitting by itself does not ferment, though it has plenty of sugars to ferment. And water, well, we've all tried fermenting water, it just grows funny things. So, mead has been around since about 7000 BCE. Our first evidences of mead in material culture, as in archaeology, are from northern China. We have a stain on an artifact that has traces of fermented honeys upon it, amongst a slew of other things. So it's quite likely that that artifact in question was being used as a container for what other boozy thing you had on hand at the time. Because it had traces of hops, it had traces of berries, primitive wines, all those sorts of things. We're not sure if that actually was properly mead yet, as if all the fermentation was coming from the honey and the water solution. But we do know that they were at least trying to ferment honey, or inadvertently fermenting honey. Mead has been a cultural, historical fascination with a large number of peoples. We see evidences in religions, folklores, and mythologies surrounding the wonderful addictive substance that comes from sweet, sweet honey when we leave it around too long, all the way back to potentially Proto-Hinduism and the Vedic scripts. They call it samna. Flashing forward a little bit more, mead has been mentioned all over the place. Aristotle mentions mead in his Historia Naturalis, pardon me, and where he calls it militas, which gets used a lot until eventually that phrasing warps over time into Germanic languages and into more modern uses, where we would now know it as mead. And then we move on to Pliny the Elder, who gets even more involved in militus. He actually provides us one of the first recipes for mead, describing how you make it and how it's different than honey wine. Presumably because Latins and Romans were busily trying to figure out, well, what does this do? Mead. What happened nowadays that mead isn't everywhere? I can't go down to my local liquor store normally and find shelves full of mead. Certainly not this wide a collection over here. What happened to mead is it is a process that is harder to industrialize. I can grow larger fields of barley. I can grow more and more grapes. Telling bees to get busier faster and making more honey is really hard to do. In fact, it's kind of a problem these days. It's why there's this thing around the internet on we're running out of bees and oh dear my honey. What am I going to do? And it's those sorts of processes that made certain other alcohols much easier to produce a lot of. Walk into your local liquor store and count how many things grow out of a barley, a hop, a rye, or some flavor of a wheat or potato. You know, things that are generally easier to grow. Honey takes work. It's worth it, but it takes work. But the culture in general, mead has been the thing in your fantasy novel, not the thing you can go down to the bar and order. I know, it's terrible. I'm sure our British viewers are looking at me like, what the hell do you mean? I can't go down to the bar and get mead? What is this? Mead is so popular in fantasy due to the fact that fantasy authors like to copy things that have come before them, which generally, I mean, come on now, let's think about it. What was some of the earliest, most successful fantasy? Oh, Tolkien. That's good. Oh, yeah, he samples a lot of Germanic and old European mythology, which is absolutely swimming in mead. Yes, doing the backstroke. So, of course, it bleeds over into Tolkien's work, which then gets copied, well, not exactly copied, run with by other authors. So they continuously harken back to a drink that, increasingly, several of them have never even had. So why are we seeing mead increasing in the United States? Well, there was a large amount of microbrewing and small-scale breweries popping up from the early thousands and late 90s till now, and smaller-scale wineries popping up as well, and distilleries. And somewhere in that process, people began to look around and say, hey, wait a minute, I can make mead. It's a similar process, it's a similar model. Sure, I need honey instead of these other things, but a lot of these smaller batch brewers don't actually do very much growing. They buy. So if you're going to buy what you're distilling anyway, why not buy honey and try to figure out how mead works? What I have here, we have everything from something that sits around a 5 or a 7 APV, 5.7, pardon me, not 5 or a 7 APV, to one of these ones on this table, goes all the way up to 17.5% alcohol by volume, which is the difference between a mild, probably pale beer and a pretty hard wine. Almost that you're not really a wine anymore level of wine, not quite the you're fully out into fortified wines and spirits, but you're certainly on the road. As I'm sure there's a vermouth or two that are around that volume, but not quite. Now, this collection doesn't even encompass all sorts of meads that there are. We have no ice mead here, or honey jack as it gets called. All these different things that can vary a mead. We also have the issue that honey is variable. Depending on what the bees have been at, your honeys could taste fruity, they could taste herby, they could taste rather more straight up like honey, they could taste blended. Depends what honeys you're using and whether or not you're using more than one kind and what all you're doing to it. I'm sure other people know better than I do exactly how you get flavors out of that. But that dynamicism means that mead can span more. So I'm going to pop open a few of these and try some for you and try to give you vague ideas of what they taste like. Because yes, we will be mixing with mead later, I promise. That is the name of the channel. But it's good to know what you're actually working with before you start slinging liquids around and trying to make it work. Because some of these will explode in a shaker, and some of these will not. So yes, we have here Havok mead. This is their root of all evil. A ginger mead, which is apparently naturally gluten-free, which means they've not added any hops back into the palate. I've kept this all more or less gingers and honeys and things like that. This one probably uses a beer yeast, definitely uses a beer yeast, and is gluten-free, which means they're just using yeast, gingers and flavors and that sort of things as an additive, but don't think chemicals here, guys, and honey and water, which gives us this very thick-looking liquid, which tastes very strong with the ginger, which is not a bad statement out of me. I love ginger. It tastes fantastic. And it's very... Mead comes in a lot of different flavors. There's meads that smack you with alcohol straight on the head. There's meads that trail off oddly. This tastes like you've taken a big old stick of ginger, dipped it in some honey, and left it to sit there a very long time, which I believe is the design intention of the meadery, and is generally a decent drink of mead. It's just a little atypical, we might say. Gingery meads were not exactly very common, as ginger and mead didn't really overlap very well for a very long period of time. So overall, as a not very typical mead that is, I'm going to admit, a little bit nicher than some, Some people were probably sitting here going, why would I want ginger in a drink? It's not for everybody, but I think it does its job fairly well. Hence, I'd say it's a perfectly serviceable mead. And probably could be mixed with fairly easily. I just would never add this to a shaker, because that's how we lose eyes. Now we have Valkyrie's Choice by Groenfell Meadery, another Vermont mead. This is a pint, because of course it comes in pints. It comes in pints! And this is a flavored mead, I believe. I'm now going to try it. Again, it is a beer yeast mead. Generally when it comes in cans, it's a good way to tell. You can tell it develops a nice little head there if you swish it around pretty violently, which means do not shake. Odd combinations of smells. I like it. I just can't tell what any of them are individually, which happens a lot on the more spiced meads. They add a bunch of things, and you can't really immediately pinpoint any one particular additive to the mead. Smells good though. So, bottoms up. It's a little crisper, a lot sweeter in my opinion, and there's more of the spice bite to it is not on the approach so much. So it's not the first flavor into my mouth. It's coming up. It's joining the mead. It's not smacking me with a stick and saying, "Hello, yes, this is the additives." It's sort of saying, "Oh yes, mead, sweet honey goodness," and then, "Oh yeah, there's a mulling of spices in there. It tastes pretty good." I still can't tell you what any one individual spice is from first taste, but I can tell you it tastes good. Like, objective to me, of course. This is a little more typical on mead. It is still a spiced mead, so we're not on something where I would just say, this flavor is mead. That's rather hard to define after all. But it's a lighter, sweeter than Havoc over here. And I'd say probably more universally applicable as the mead you hand to your buddy of, here man, try this. You know, someone who's never had mead before, I'd recommend this as a starter if you know you probably are open to spiced meads. Overall, I think it's serviceable as a generally usable. So, Groenfell, Valkyrie's Choice. So we're back. So we have here Ancient Fire's rather more standard beer yeast, which I believe they call making it happen. And we have over here the toaster pastry, which we have called toaster party too many times. The toaster pastry is a mixture of a lot of different berry fruits, hence it's a multi-fruit toaster pastry. Yeah, great party going on in that. I'm going to start with the more regular one. We see here, very yellowy in color. It has a head to it normally. It's died down a little because it took a minute. The smell is what I generally expect on mead. It's a lot of that fermented honey sweetness smell. There's not a lot of herbiness or spice additive or fruit to cover the flavor. So if anyone else was to try something like this, you would now understand the smell of mead. It has a very frothy, beer yeasty styled mead palate to it. It's got the bubbles. It is pretty heavily carbonated. It has a lot of that consistency that I expect. So I'd say it's for what this is trying to be, it's doing it magnificently. Also, when you're at a meadery, I highly suggest trying their more or less straight up traditional style mead, no funny business, because it tells you what product they're working with for the rest. It's a good base to base assessments on. That being said, I think this is a perfectly good mead. It's just very basic, meaning if I was to mix with a mead, I would either use something that's very wild in flavor, that isn't a flavor you normally find to mix with, that you know what you're doing with, or a flavor that is very mead with not a whole heck of a lot else going on, so you can still taste meaty flavors in whatever you're going to be mixing, as I'm sure you all see in a bit. That being said, I'm actually rather a fan of this one for very simples, very straightforwards. So for anyone who doesn't like anything too overtly sweet, or doesn't particularly like different spices being added to alcohols, this is the mead for you to try. Or a mead like this, if you are not in New England, where these are more readily findable. Going back for the third sip, that's how you know it's a good one. Or a good one, I should say. So, as we see here, it is very clearly a fruit-added mead, as that is not the color mead normally is. That is some kind of mixture of berries. I can't remember what all is in there. It's something like strawberries and raspberries and blueberries, and if it's a berry and it tastes good, it's been thrown in this mead bottle, is basically what's happened. So during the fermentation process, they add in the juices, and it ferments alongside the mead, meaning that not just the honey is fermenting, however, the main mode is the honey, meaning that most of the time that fermentation has occurred, it's been the honey. Very fruity aroma, and again, it's that weird combination of fruits where you can't exactly pin any one of them other than all of the good ones. You know, the berry patch. I find this one's they're very similar in mouthfeel, if I'm going to use words from wine snobs and whiskey addicts. I quite like the taste, which means nothing wrong with it. It's a very aggressive bubbler, as we may or may not have noticed. As it's still bubbling away right here. That adds a lot to the profile of the drink. I'd say it's bubblier than the other one. The other one was overtly bubbly, not overtly bubbly. Come on, you only had how much meat already? I like it for fruitiness, for a low alcohol per volume, fruity, 5-ish % ABV, 5.7 in there, beer yeast mead. I'd say this is one of the better ones I've had. So, you know, if you're into that sort of thing, which I suspect a lot of people who are interested in mead would be, not a bad one to try. As people who have been viewing the channel may or may not have noticed, we use dragon glassware a lot here. They make these rather artful looking pieces, which you just don't find everywhere, that we think make the cocktails and drinks we like pouring into them look just that much more fantastic. We're also totally not sponsored by Dragon Glassware. We just like using their products a lot. What we have before us right now is 1634 meadery and Moonlight meadery. Closest to me is Blueberry Dream, middle is Viking Victory, and the last one is simply just called Darkness, this is obviously using blueberries, that's spiced, and that uses elderberries, hence why it looks like ink. Hilariously enough, blueberries are probably the most commonly referred to berry being used in mead, as was previously mentioned, adding berries made it that much easier to sustain your yeast back when you're using wild yeasts in meads. The blueberry would give it something else to latch onto and help break down. It was also used as a way to store surplus berries for winter, as you could shove a whole bunch in there. They eventually wouldn't break down because the alcohol content had reached, the yeast had died off and the alcohol content had reached a plateau. What you would basically do is partially ferment very little tiny amounts the berries, meaning you could enjoy them all winter long. Now anyway, while we're on about that, we're on to the blueberry in 1634. 1634 is probably the first meadery in the United States that I had stumbled upon, or at least the first one that I had bought a lot of product from. They make exclusively wine yeast meads, which means that their alcohol volumes range in the 12s to, I think they go all the way to 17.5, as mentioned earlier, meaning that these are meads that are more like wines in character and more like wines in profile. So if I switch this around a whole lot, there's no head. So we have what is a very traditional-ish mead here. Traditional in my mind, I tend to think of meads as more that beer yeast than a wine yeast, but that could just be entirely me. Let me know if you think that meads usually use a wine yeast. I'd love to have that conversation. But it's entirely made within what we have documented in context. We've had people talk about blueberries in their mead in all sorts of sagas and eddas. We've also had people refer to mulberries, etc. Not necessarily blueberry, but berries in mead have been mentioned time in and time out by countless sagas and eddas and bards tailing and just about every fantasy author. Anyhow, back to the drink. You almost immediately, or at least I would almost immediately notice that it's a lot higher in alcohol content. You get that much stronger flavor. It tastes a bit more like a wine profile. It's a very palatable change from drinking a bunch of beer yeast mead previously, where I was having an anticipation of bubbly and very thick and frothy of a substance. This is a very clear, very smooth, very much more refined drink. As for flavor, the blueberry is there, but it doesn't taste like you're literally just juiced a bunch of blueberries. It tastes like you juiced a bunch of blueberries, added to mead, and then fermented everything, which I know isn't very helpful. I think it's a very good flavor. Also, all of these wine yeasted meads are probably much easier to mix with because you can put them into the shaker and it probably won't blow up. This blueberry I would almost certainly be tempted to try something with, which I'm sure we'll see later. But as I mentioned before, I've never actually mixed with mead. It's always been that thing you enjoy by yourself. So we're going to see what I do with it. I do enjoy the flavor of this. Moving on, however, we have what is possibly the most traditional and overt mead ever tasted by me. It's from 1634, like the glass says. It is Viking Victory. And the catchline is, because you always wanted to be a Viking. I know you probably can't read that, but I thought it was hilarious. Viking Victory is a spiced, thicker, longer aged mead. It's very ambery in profile, and I think it has a very wide range of flavor in it, as it uses whole manners of things to add flavors to mead. It's not trying to hide the flavor of mead, of course, it's just fortifying around it with a wide choir of tastes. So. I usually get a taste of cinnamon and clove and that sort of thing off of Viking Victory. But after drinking all of this mead, I'm immediately hit by the spices used, because everything else. There's a mead flavor here. There's a mead flavor here. This is probably the more spiced and more variety of spiced of meads that I have tasted in this rack. It's more balanced, I'd say. There's meatiness to it, but there's also a lot of richness brought out by the spice palette. Anyhow, as we must eventually wrap up all things, so too will we eventually wrap up this mead tasting. Here we have probably the thickest, darkest, most interesting looking mead I have ever seen, which is of course why we put it in one of the dragon glasswares, because it looks like I am staring at a alchemist vial full of ink. This is ridiculous. This is out of a fantasy novel. And almost immediately you can smell elderberry from. I didn't even have to put my nose over the glass, but I did anyway because elderberry smelled great. It's that pungent. I mean, I could probably get the smell of elderberry across the entire room if I just let it sit there for a minute. And there's almost a sort of viscosity to the liquid that I don't see on 1634. So this is by Moonlight Meadery. It's a different manufacturer. It's an overwhelmingly tart flavor, meaning it's very heavy in the elderberry. I think that kind of hides a lot of the rest of the flavor of the mead. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I've ordered an elderberry mead. I want to taste elderberries. That's an agreement we've had here while grabbing a bottle. But there's also a rather heavy-handed wine yeasty taste to it that I'm personally not that much of a fan of. If you like wine, you probably think this tastes great. As you may or may not have noticed through this tasting, wine and I are not best friends. Nothing wrong there. But I'd call this it's more experientially beneficial than taste, in my humble opinion right now. It smells great. It tastes pretty good. It's just there's this aftertaste of yeast that I just can't get out of my mouth right now. So I'm going to have to take another sip to get the elderberry back in here. Yeah. Personally, not that large of a fan of it, but I'm sure there's somebody who'd think that is fantastic. I'm just not him. So yeah, that was our taste through a giant pile of mead. That is by no means a definitive list of mead. I'm sure anyone can name off, I'm sure there's someone who can name off a large listing of meads that we don't even have here, or specific variants of mead that aren't produced around here, or could find different flavors elsewhere or different meaderies elsewhere. That's the scene on mead in the United States. There's not one universal manufacturer that ships across state lines that's universal in stores at the moment. I can't walk into a liquor store and find, oh yeah, they're a major mead manufacturer, you know what they taste like. Like the Bacardi of rum, or Jack Daniels, and any of those sorts of things. They don't exist in mead. So get to know your local scene, poke around, and try a few glasses. Who knows? Eventually, you might just wake up one day, finding yourselves in chainmail, drinking out of a horn, and having a great time. Or is that just me?